Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a Faculty of Forestry webinar. And so today, what we're going to do is I will first of all introduce Dr. Cole Burton, and he will introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Justine Smith. So many of you will know Cole. Cole is an assistant professor in the Department of Forest Resources Management in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC. And his research group is the Wildlife Coexistence Lab, and they work on all kinds of interesting projects to do with human-wildlife interactions. And so we're going to be having a seminar from Cole in the new year in our Faculty of Forestry series. So look for that. I just wanted to encourage people to nominate external researchers for our research seminar next spring. So we will be doing virtual seminars again, and just send your nominations to me. And with that, I will turn things over to Cole and Justine.
Great. Thank you very much, Sally. And thanks also to Michelle Lindsay and others involved in running this seminar series. We're really grateful to have the chance to bring in outside speakers. And certainly I'd also like to acknowledge the members of my own lab, and particularly Michael Procco, who played a big role in nominating today's speaker and helping to organize the schedule. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Justine Smith, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Wildlife, Fish, and Conservation Biology at the University of California, Davis. And I'm very excited to have Dr. Smith join us today, even if it is virtually. Certainly we hope to get her up to UBC here at some point in the future. But our lab has been closely following Dr. Smith's exciting work on top predators like cougars, which are certainly species that capture the public attention, as we've seen recently from some of the viral cougar videos that maybe a lot of you have seen. And these are also species that present very difficult challenges in achieving human-wildlife coexistence. So just briefly, a little bit of background on Dr. Smith. She received her BA from the University of Colorado Boulder, and she received her PhD in 2017 from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she worked with Chris Wilmers. And then she was a postdoc researcher at the University of California, Berkeley for a few years in Arthur Middleton's group. And she recently launched her own lab at UC Davis. She was just telling me she got it started only a few months before the pandemic hit. So a very exciting new up and coming lab that she's running. And research interests in her lab focus on how to best preserve the ecological roles of mammalian carnivores and herbivores in landscapes that are shared with people. And they do this by investigating human-wildlife interactions and the effects of risk in both predators and prey. And to do this research, Justine has used some very innovative methods to assess animal responses to risk, bringing in some much needed experimental approaches to try and get good answers to these questions, including a really neat study where they combine camera trapping with sound playbacks of voices of some famous US talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh and Rachel Maddow. So I'm not sure if this is going to come up in the seminar. I don't want to give away too many more details. So I just want to hand it over to Justine for her talk about anthropogenic influences on the role of a top predator. So take it away, Justine, and thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Well, thanks so much, Cole. That's just the most wonderful introduction, and I really wish I could be on your beautiful campus with you all today, but it's still great to be there virtually and get to meet some of the great folks at UBC. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. I hope everyone can see my screen okay. If anyone can't, I don't know, just yell or something, but I'll assume that it is sharing and y'all can see that.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great, thanks. Right, so Cole mentioned that today I'll be talking about the anthropogenic influences on the ecological role of a top predator, specifically the puma, mountain lion, cougar, whatever your favorite name is for this animal. I've been working with pumas in both North and South America for the better part of the last decade, and we'll be sharing two very different case studies with you about how people change the ecological role of this top predator. So one of the most common ways that we think about in terms of how humans impact the ecological role of top predators is through trophic downgrading. And generally we think about trophic downgrading as humans reducing the density or distribution of a top predator, which leads to the release and maybe increase in density or distribution of prey animals. And although this is an incredibly widespread phenomenon due to global patterns of predator extirpation, it's certainly not the only way that humans impact the ecological role of top predators. So we can think sort of specifically that direct exploitation is kind of a one way that trophic downgrading happens through the reduction of the density of animals through lethal methods. But direct exploitation can also cause risk effects in top predators, where they might try to avoid areas or times of high human activity to reduce those lethal effects. And of course, exploitation can also directly impact prey animals through both density and risk effects. So this is kind of maybe your traditional idea of a trophic downgrading, whereby actual removal of predators has effects on the predator-prey interaction. However, a lot of other ways that humans interact with the environment can cause changes in the predator and prey relationships. So habitat loss and fragmentation is a great example, where there can be lethal effects on both predator and prey through vehicle collisions, poisoning, other sort of human-associated risks, and animals can respond to those risks by changing their activity patterns or their space use. And so we can see these risk effects also come into play in areas of modified habitat. Even non-extractive recreation can cause risk effects as well in wildlife by changing their activity and habitat use. And of course, novel top-down forces like predators or diseases that are introduced or spread by human activities can again cause lethal effects, of course, but also can change the way that animals respond behaviorally to different habitat features. And so the ways that humans impact the role of top predators is incredibly diverse and probably additive or interactive across these different kinds of human impacts. But today I'll be focusing on two case studies from my own work. The first one, which looks at how humans cause fear effects from their activity with consequences to the way that predators interact with their prey. And then the second case study will be how an introduced top-down force can come in and alter the mechanism of a trophic cascade and change the relationship between predators and the species that they interact with. So I'll start today by talking about how humans can instill fear in animals and change their interactions. Now, I've been thinking about the ways that human activity changes animal behavior for a long time, and I've been working with folks, Caitlin Gaynor and Justin Serassi, on trying to put all this information into a common framework, which you can see here. And I obviously don't expect you to read all of this, but mostly what we've been thinking through is how human activity causes a mismatch in the actual risk to an animal from human activities and the response that they show to those activities. So either animals can have a lethal human activity presented to them over on the right side of this diagram. They can maybe not detect or correctly assess or correctly respond to that threat, leading to injury or death. But on the left side of the diagram here, animals can also be faced with benign human activities, and they can assess those incorrectly and perceive them as risky, leading to changes in antipredator behavior, including changes in spatial distribution and activity, which can eventually lead to range contractions or reduced population growth rates. And all of these risk-response mismatches can change the relationship between predators and their prey by changing the density of the population or just the behavior and distribution. So today I'll be focusing on this version of a risk-response mismatch where animals are incorrectly assessing the risk from people. And I'm examining this question about animals over-responding to human presence in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California, with mountain lions. This is an incredibly developed area. You can see here development from the South San Francisco Bay Area bleeding into the mountains. There's quite a bit of exurban development in this landscape. So here's just a zoom in about what this area looks like. Here's the Santa Cruz Mountains, just south of the San Francisco Bay and north of Monterey Bay on the California Central Coast. And in this map, you can see here, every dot represents a building. So this is a housing density plot where the red areas are urban, but the purple areas are these sort of low density exurban areas. And so the lions that live in this area are exposed to a lot of human disturbance and activities. And yet in California, hunting of mountain lions is illegal. So we don't see a take of mountain lions in terms of hunting, although they are certainly at risk of people here from vehicle collisions and from depredation with livestock. But generally, for the most part, animals' exposure to humans in the system is through housing development and recreation, these sort of benign human disturbances that don't pose a direct lethal threat to the animals. And so first, to examine if humans can change the relationship or the role of predators in regulating their prey, their relationships to their prey through fear effects, we have to first know if pumas do fear humans. This was the experiment that Cole mentioned in the beginning, but I'd like to share a little bit more about the details with you. So we examined if pumas actually fear people by deploying motion-censored playback systems out on puma kills. So we located puma kill sites, and then we put out these cameras that were linked to speakers so we could play different sounds to them and measure their responses. And for our control, we used Pacific tree frogs. We use this as a control because this should be a familiar sound to mountain lions. It's common, ubiquitous. They should be ambivalent to frogs. They don't consume them, they don't compete with them. It's certainly not a predator, so they shouldn't have any relationship to this sound. And their frequency range is similar to that of people. Our treatment group, as I mentioned, was, or as Cole mentioned, was talk radio. And I promise we didn't just do this for fun. These are high quality recordings, not in terms of the content necessarily, but in terms of the characteristics of the recording. It actually sounds like a human speaking. They're a single individual and conversational. So it's not the sound of a bunch of people yelling. It should be a pretty benign human cue to these animals, as if a hiker was just walking by. And it's unambiguous. There's no kind of other music or sound effects that you would get from other human recordings like podcasts. So we played these sounds to mountain lions at their kills, and I'd like to show you an example of one of our trials here.
This because the grand jury rendered a correct verdict, Ferguson.
So what you just saw was very representative of what we saw across the animals that we exposed to this experiment and to these treatments. Pretty much animals did not flee from the sound of the frogs. You can see that in the top left diagram here. We only had one individual flee from the frog treatment. Interestingly, it was one of our more human-associated cats. This may indicate that he sort of became sensitized and rather than habituated to human disturbances to live in that landscape. And then for the most part, almost every individual did flee from the sound of the human trial. So we saw a very dramatic difference in that initial response to the treatments. Then we also saw that it took longer in the center diagram here for animals to return to the carcass after exposure to these different trials. So after response to humans, animals took a lot longer to come back and feed if they did return. And this led to an overall reduction in the total of time spent feeding on their kill. And just to show you how sort of dramatic that is in terms of the animal's access to its own resource, here on the bottom, I've just included some other statistics. So of 3 individuals that left after hearing the frog treatment, only 1 actually fled, 2 of them walked away, but 5 individuals fled from the sound of humans and never returned to feed. So that was 5 out of, I believe, 12 or 13 individuals completely abandoned their kill. And this affected the median feeding time, whereby after the frog, we saw about 5 minutes of total feeding time. And after the humans, we saw a median of 2 seconds of feeding time. Pretty much after exposure to humans, these animals fled and gave up access to feeding opportunities on their kills. So now we have some initial evidence that, number 1, pumas do fear humans, and number 2, that it causes some kind of energetic cost by giving up food resources. But giving up food isn't the only way that humans cause an energetic cost to these animals. I investigated a question more generally about the energetic cost of fear with Yue Wang, who led this study, where we just looked at the cost of changes in movement behavior closer to residential areas and in more natural areas. And by pairing accelerometer collars with GPS sensors, we were able to find that animals increased the time that they were active, but only at night, by over 50%. So a huge increase in movement rates and activity at nighttime in both females and males. This led to an overall daily energetic cost of about 500 kilocalories for both males and females. And this translates to about an increase in daily caloric expenditure of 10 to 12% for each of these animals. So just by moving more at night near people because of disruptions, generally we see this, this increase because of more changes from inactive to active states at nighttime around people, potentially from disturbances. We see this increase in energetic cost, which we calculated as increasing the predicted annual kill rate by 3 or 4 deer per year for these animals. And this is pretty significant because mountain lions only really need to kill about 20 deer per year to survive. It's very energetically costly to kill deer. So this increase in annual kill rate that would be required just to deal with the cost of moving is actually pretty substantial. And so now we have 2 pieces of evidence that just moving more is a cost to animals in more developed areas, but that they also are likely to be disturbed by people at their kill sites and potentially give up feeding opportunities. So we wanted to actually look at what the consequences of both of these behaviors are on the kill rates of animals living across an urban to rural gradient in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so to do that, we visited a bunch of kill sites in the field by looking for clusters of GPS points from collars, which basically means any place that the animal was hanging out for a long period of time, which could be a kill site, a sleeping site, or a den. And so over 6 years, we tracked about 30 pumas and went to 700 of these clusters in the field, of which 200 of them were deer kills. And then we used this field investigated data to create a predictive model from all of our Puma GPS data, which was about 8,500 clusters from all of our collars, to predict 1,500 deer kills that we could look at across this housing density gradient. So here's just an example of what one of these clusters looks like. Here's a puma track in an exurban area in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And this group of points here, this cluster, represents this kill site, which was about 30 meters from a house. You can see the buck kill at the bottom of the photo. And we were interested in trying to see if measures of fear or avoidance of humans related to killing behavior. So to do that, at each of these predicted kills, we looked at how nocturnal the animals were at these kill sites, their fidelity to the kill, so how much time did they actually spend there versus away from the kill, how far did they travel away while they were still feeding, and the overall time they actually spent at the kill itself. And so this is a lot of bar plots, but to orient you, we have those 4 covariates. Here we have the total time spent feeding in the top left, the nocturnality in the top right, the proportion of time, the fidelity to the kill in the bottom left, and how far they traveled in the bottom right. Males are here in orange, and the darker colors represent higher housing density. And so what I think you'll notice here is that we really didn't see males respond at all to housing density, to their behavior at kills, except for that they became more nocturnal. But females, on the other hand, responded strongly in all of these variables. We saw them exhibit higher nocturnality, moving farther away from the kill, so there's that movement cost, spending a lower proportion of time at the kill overall, and reduced total pre-consumption time, amounting to about a 42% reduction in time spent at the kill with the opportunity to feed. So just to show you what an example of these differences might look like, here's a map of all of our predicted kills, and I'm going to zoom in on this box here to show you 2 example kills, one that's in the middle of one of the biggest protected areas in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and one that's right along that urban edge. The urban area is shown here in gray. Kill 2 is right on the edge of an exurban neighborhood. So for this first kill, the dots here represent locations from Puma 28F, and the times are color-coded by day, crepuscular, and night. And you can see that pretty much all of her locations are very close to the kill. All but one are within 100 meters, which is that red circle around the kill, which is represented by a star. And so we don't see far distance traveled. We see very high fidelity, and overall quite a bit of time spent at the kill. Now, in this other kill from nearby, which is the same duration of total time spent, on this cluster in total, for this kill made by 13F in this exurban area, we see that she's only using the kill right in the middle of the night, and then she travels away to bed down further away during the daytime before returning to feed and then leaving. So not only does she have the energetic cost of moving, but she also gives up a lot of feeding opportunity by only being at the kill at night. And what we found was that these behavioral adaptations to human disturbance directly translated to the relationship between pumas and their deer prey. So here I'm showing you how kill rate is a function of housing density in each animal's home range. And males, which didn't show a behavioral response at kills, also didn't show a relationship between these 2 variables, but females that had all of these very strong behavioral responses also had an incredibly strong linear relationship whereby the more housing density that was in their home range, the higher their kill rate was. So animals in this top edge of housing densities killed about 36% more deer per year than these animals in the more rural areas. So you can see this as a difference of about 15 to 20 deer per year rather than 3 to 4. So the difference in kill rate is much higher than we predicted from the movement cost alone. And it's probably due to not only the cost of moving, but also giving up of feeding opportunities when disturbed by people. So basically what we've learned from this system is that there is evidence for animals incorrectly assessing risk by over-responding to these benign human disturbances, perceiving people as risky, even though mostly they're exposed to hikers and mountain bikers and just sort of residential development. This leads to a change in anti-predator behavior with activity shifts and also some spatial avoidance, but not to the effect that it leads to habitat loss, but rather just causes more energetic and reproductive costs. Now, unfortunately, we still don't know if there's a population level effect of these behaviors or if it actually affects the prey population itself. So we know that humans change the relationship of pumas to their prey by requiring them to kill more prey to compensate for energetic losses. But we don't know if that has any implications for the population growth of the deer in the system. And I have a grad student right now who's hopefully going to be investigating some of these relationships in Southern California, where we do plan to have more information on the deer population. So before I move on, I just want to point out that these systems are much more complex than a single predator-prey pair, and a lot of other folks in the Wilmer's group and the Santa Cruz Puma Project have investigated different elements of how humans cause fear in wildlife and the cascading effects of those behavioral changes. So if you're interested in this kind of work, I encourage you to check out some of the other research that's been done in the group. Now I want to move on to a very different study system. Although the species, the mountain lion is the same, the system is incredibly different. And here I'll be talking about more how humans change the mechanism of a trophic cascade through introducing a new top-down force. So generally we think about, again, these trophic relationships as predators eating prey and then causing a release for vegetation. But just as humans can cause fear effects in top predators can have fear effects in prey. And so we can see both effects from lethal activities and through scaring prey to change their behavior. Now, today I'll be talking about how human-introduced disease can also play a role as a top predator in the system. And the question I'll be addressing is, do human-introduced top forces serve the same role in trophic control as native top predators? And what does that mean for the outcome for whole ecosystems? And I just want to point out that this work is currently in review and was contributed to by a number of incredible collaborators and was co-led by Julia Monk at Yale. So if you're interested in following her and her work, I encourage you to do so. So the system I'll be sharing in this case study is in San Guillermo National Park. It's in the high Andes of Argentina. Again, the puma is, as in Santa Cruz, the only top predator in the system. And its primary prey is the vicuña, which is a very cool camelid species that alpacas were actually domesticated from vicuñas. So these animals live at this very high elevation park and in this incredibly stark, arid landscape whereby the habitat types are very delineated. So here's a map of the park and the 3 habitat types that are present there. The plains, which is in the top photo, are these flat, open areas with very little vegetation. The meadows are places that have much more vegetation, which serve as both food for vicuñas, but also as stocking cover for pumas. And then the canyons, which are great stocking habitats for pumas, but they are generally avoided by vicuñas because vegetation is not that great and the risk is just too high. So we already know a lot about predator-prey interactions in San Guillermo, having had collars on both predator and prey for quite a few years. This figure on the left shows habitat selection at nighttime by vicuñas and pumas, and although the scale is a little bit larger in the puma map, you might see some of the same habitat features, that these animals completely partition habitats at night. Essentially, pumas scare vicuñas into the open plains during risky times at night, but vicuñas are sort of have to use risky habitats during the day to access food resources. So here you can see in the figure, we have very high encounter rates between pumas and vicuñas in meadows, these high quality feeding sites during the day. And then at night, and then we also see very high kill risk, lethal risk to vicuñas in meadows across all times of day. What I want to draw your attention to are these yellow diamonds, which show puma-vicuña interactions in plains. And even though there's still fairly high encounter probability in plains at night, regardless of time of day, if you look at the right-hand plot, the number of kills that occur divided by the availability of this habitat type is always below 1. So we always see kills in meadows less than the proportion that they're available in the landscape. So plains are a very strong refuge in this system, and vicuñas use this diel migration to access good food during the day and then use this refuge at night. Now, vicuñas are clearly aware that they're more at risk in canyon and meadow habitats than in plains. They are more vigilant in canyon and meadow habitats. They show very low vigilance in plains where pumas just really can't stalk them or get close to them because it's so open. They also spend a much higher proportion of their time spent foraging. So even though there's not very much food in plains, whatever there is, vicuñas are eating it because that's the safe habitat. And you can see this play out in this exclosure experiment done by my colleagues where I think this is just incredibly dramatic that when you put up an exclosure, a lot of vegetation can grow in these plains, and yet you can see how completely effective vicuñas have been at eating every single bit of vegetation across these vast expanses down to nothing because these are the safe habitats. And so what this tells us is that the trophic cascade in San Guillermo National Park historically was really one that was driven by these behavioral effects. So vicuñas, in being afraid of risk of pumas, change where they forage and where they spend time, and have this very dramatic cascading effect on the vegetation in the refuge, which are these open plains, completely depleting vegetation down to nothing in these habitat types. Another important player in the system are condors, which are completely dependent on puma kills to access food. These are obligate scavengers, and you can see here almost all the kills that they were documented using by my collaborator Paula Perig were puma kills in both the wet and dry season. So that's kind of how it worked in the park until 2015, where a mange outbreak came into play. And here's just what some of the evidence of mange looks like. It causes alopecia or hair loss. It's a mite that gets into the skin and the fur of these animals to the effect that they can't really walk anymore after they have a lot of the mites on their body. And it's strongly believed that this mange outbreak that came to the park in 2015 originated from domestic llamas. Now, domestic llamas were not released into the park. This is an incredibly remote park, very, very challenging place to get to, I can attest. But another camelid, the guanaco, migrates elevationally and is thought maybe to have brought mange from this domestic source into the park. So this is incredibly sort of a human contributed new top-down force in the system that came from incredibly far away and somehow made it into this remote preserve. And by 2019, what had been called the Serengeti of the Andes had basically collapsed to only 70 individual vicuñas being observed in the park in 2019. So just to give you like a little bit more context about what this collapse looked like, we saw in August 2015, the proportion of animals with GPS collars that were both found dead and alive that had mange increased to 100% by April 2017. We also saw that the proportion of kills that had evidence of mange from pumas surpassed those without mange in that same time period. And ultimately, through density estimates, we found that the vicuña population, while it was increasing before 2015, completely collapsed almost to zero. So what caused this population collapse? Either mange could have made vicuñas more vulnerable to pumas because it basically prevents them from being able to walk. And this should have led to increased predation pressure on vicuñas. or mange could have directly killed the Bucunas, displacing Pumas as the top-down force in the system. So we investigated this mechanism by looking at kill rates over time, and we found that there was no change in the number of kills being made by Pumas before or after the mange outbreak. So this tells us that mange was directly killing Bucunas rather than just making them more susceptible to predation. So instead of changing the relationship necessarily between Pumas and Bucunas, it just became more important of a top-down force than Pumas were. And so how did this change in mechanism alter the trophic cascade in the system? Remember I said before the trophic cascade was basically driven by these behavioral effects, and now we have instead these density effects, this population collapse. So what did that mean for the ecosystem as a whole? To look at the first trophic relationship that we're interested in with condors, we looked at the proportion of locations on tagged condors that were in the park before and after mange. Unfortunately, we only had about 9 months of data before mange happened, before mange became really widespread in the park, but we did see this collapse over time whereby condors essentially abandoned the park altogether. You can see that in a little bit more detail in these plots on the bottom right, where we see a lot of locations from condors right before the mange outbreak and sort of during the big population collapse. Obviously, there's a lot of prey available to condors during those big mortality events, but then eventually there just weren't any animals left, any carrion left, and they essentially left the park entirely. We also looked at the effect on vegetation in the park, and we found that in the risky habitats, meadows and canyons, there was no change in a number of vegetation characteristics we looked at. Here I'm showing you standing green biomass. That's probably because Bucunas already weren't consuming a lot of those resources because of the strong fear effects in the system. But in the refuge, on the other hand, in the plains, we saw this dramatic increase in biomass as a result of the collapse of Bucunas in the system. These changes could be seen from the landscape level, from space. We looked at landscape level patterns of the change in greenness, or NDVI. And you can see here before the mange outbreak, there was really no pattern of NDVI increasing or decreasing. After this outbreak, we saw almost the whole landscape showed evidence of an increasing slope of greenness. And you can see that represented in these photos here taken from the same spot before and after mange. You can see the dramatic increase in vegetation there. And just another way to show that, here's our study area specifically. The outline is where we had Vicuña movement locations. And you can see that especially in these plains habitats, what's in tan on the left figure, we see NDVI increasing quite a bit since the mange outbreak. So in general, we saw beforehand there was this behaviorally mediated trophic cascade where Pumas were the top-down force in the system. And afterward, when this sort of human-derived mange outbreak entered the system, the mange itself became the dominant top-down force, having dramatic effects on the scavenger and the plant communities, as well as the prey animal itself. So the implications of this work are that human-induced disease can alter not only the source of top-down control, but also the mechanism that it influences trophic cascades with very dramatic ecosystem consequences. And for me, what that tells me is that it's just really essential to understand different regulation by top-down forces. Anthropogenic changes to landscapes are incredibly diverse. They take a lot of forms. Novel predators and diseases, or even habitat contexts, will continue to change how top-down forces are acting on prey animals. And so we really need to understand how the regulation of prey differs between these top-down forces to anticipate and react to anthropogenic change. So just to sort of summarize here, I've given you two examples from my work about how humans impact the ecological role of top predators, first through causing fear in the top predator itself, which can alter behavior and energetics that shifts the relationship that predators have with their prey. But humans can also change the role by introducing new top-down forces that supplant top predators, can change the mechanism of trophic cascades with these landscape-wide ecological shifts as a consequence. And I look forward to continuing to ask these questions. I think that, as I showed you at the beginning, there are so many ways that humans impact the ecological role of top predators. And if we really want to conserve systems, we have to think about how humans change these processes aside from sort of the big picture changes in density and distribution, but also through behavioral change and other kinds of mechanisms. So thank you all so much again for being here and for listening. And I want to give a huge thanks to our supporters and my incredible team of collaborators, field assistants, and photographers that I've been able to work with in both of these systems. These projects take a real army to get these sorts of data, and just want to give credit to all of these incredible people who contributed to this work. And so with that, I think I'm ready to take questions, and thanks again.
Thank you so much, Justine. That was a great presentation. Two very fascinating case studies and some really impressive work. And I'm definitely eager to see the results down the road too, because I think you've set up nicely some follow-up study too. So that's great. And I just wanted to remind everyone listening that we're taking the questions through Slido. So if you can go on to slido.com and pop in UBC Forestry as the code for this event, all one word lowercase, then you can put in your question there. And I'm going to be relaying those questions to Justine. We've got some nice time here for questions. So I'm going to jump right in. We've got quite a few coming already. And people can vote on questions too to sort of see which ones they want to see asked first. So the top one right now is a question about the first case study you talked about. And the question is, what were the differences between females with dependents versus solitary females with regard to the kill rates and housing density? So were you able to parse out that part?
Right. We did not. Females in our system are often reproductively active. We don't generally see females not having kittens for long periods of time. So we weren't really able to parse that out. Also, just the differences in how females hunt early on in having kittens versus having adult kittens that need more food but can also travel with them. I think we often think of females with young and without young as sort of the comparison, but there's also a lot of difference just in the age of the kitten as well in terms of the hunting strategy and energetics. So we weren't really able to piece that apart, unfortunately, but yeah, I mean, you generally would anticipate that a female without kittens would have lower energetic requirements, and so maybe wouldn't be taking as many risks to access more food. But yeah, I don't really know the answer to that.
Sure, yeah. Well, a related question that someone asked is why do you think the male cougars were showing these different responses to the females?
So just in general, what I didn't note on that kill rate plot was that males just aren't really in as high of housing density areas in general. They don't get to as developed of habitats for the most part until they start getting older and getting kicked out of the best home ranges. But their home ranges are much larger as well. So even a large home range where the outskirts are exposed to a lot of development don't have as much of a concentration as the smaller female home ranges that can kind of be tucked into these residential areas. And so we see some females living basically in towns, eating raccoons and house cats primarily. And so I think they're just exposed to a bit higher of a risk. And they also have different sort of behavioral requirements. The males have to do these territorial sort of routes around their home ranges, and females don't really have to do that. So I think that's part of the reason as well.
Great, yeah. Interesting. And you already partly asked another question. There are a few more kind of related to this first case study. So one was, to what extent do the pumas predate on pets in that area? Like, how important are these pets or other sort of human-derived sources to their diet? And so you said that they are eating some of the pets.
So yeah, I don't know if you can all, I just think I reshared my screen here, but here's the breakdown of kills across housing density gradients that we saw in our system. And essentially we see animals eating almost entirely deer in areas with no housing nearby. And by the time you get into these more suburban areas, cats become 20% of the diet. So I think that's an added energetic cost. Is not only are we seeing increased kill rates on deer specifically, but we're also seeing that deer make up a lower proportion of the diet. So if you think about adding all these other prey animals as well, that's even higher kill rates if you look across the whole gambit. Unfortunately, we couldn't model kill rates for smaller animals because it's really hard to detect them from coarse GPS data. But we do know that they shift some of their diet to these smaller animals, and it's probably less efficient to kill those smaller animals. So just anecdotally, there was one female who was eating almost entirely raccoons and house cats. She had a litter of 4 that she had just abandoned one at a time until they all were left to starve to death. So I don't think that switching to these smaller prey sources is necessarily really an energetic advantage. In some ways, it might be a bit of an ecological trap.
Interesting. And I guess sort of one more related question that I might follow up on too, but someone was wondering if there are many cougar attacks on people in this area, like how much of, I know it's sort of a low risk, I would say, but you know, how much does that happen? And
yeah, it had never happened in the Santa Cruz Mountains until 2014, when a child, I think maybe he was 7 or 8 years old, was sort of grabbed by a puma in the middle of the day just on a trail, and the dad was able to scare the puma off and the kid was fine, luckily. So we've never had any fatalities in recorded history since the 1800s in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which I think is pretty incredible. You know, early on when I was doing this work, somebody asked me what the implications were. You know, is this good or bad for mountain lions that they're doing all this behavioral modification? And I actually think it's sort of a good example of they're not losing habitat. They can use these residential areas for hunting. That's great that these areas are not off limits to them, that they're not so overly responding that they give up places where they can hunt for prey, but that they're able to modify their behavior to not freak people out. They're not interacting a lot with people, which probably makes living with them more palatable. So it's kind of it seems like sort of a perfect system where they really don't, besides this one event, they don't interact with people, they don't attack people. Most people don't see them. Really, the only conflict is around livestock. Mostly people who have 1 to 3 goats is pretty common in the mountains. And so trying to make sure that those people have the resources to protect their animals is really important. But yeah, there's not a lot of conflict aside from that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And you know, I can't help but thinking about some of our communities in BC here. We have a lot of pumas, or cougars as we tend to call them. But we also have a lot of communities where there's problems with deer abundance in the communities, and you know, there's concerns or attempts to control the deer population by killing deer. And I'm curious, you know, is that, like, do we still have cougars that are predating on some of these deer in the urban areas, and it's just sort of a numerical response isn't strong enough, or maybe we're less tolerant when the cougars are seen, because they certainly don't, they seem to be removed pretty quickly if they show up in these communities, and maybe either there could be more tolerance down in the Santa Cruz Mountains, or the cougars are just not seen as much because they're so well adapted to getting their kills and moving quickly when they hear the voices and these kinds of things. It's really fascinating to think how it might apply in different areas.
Yeah, I think the cultural thing is really important, because when I showed up in Santa Cruz, I was shocked at how a lot of people in these rural communities enjoy living among wildlife. They want wildlife to be there, even wildlife like mountain lions. The first time I found a house cat who I could track to the owner, you know, like to my face was crying about the loss of his cat while saying, we know we take risks to live here and it's worth it to live in the mountains, which is not something that I had ever heard before working on wolves before starting in this program. I was shocked. And now a lot of people have cameras in their backyards. They know which mountain lions live in their neighborhood. We actually have a public Puma tracker on the website so people can see which animals live in their neighborhoods, and people like that information and they identify with the animals. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's really different than places that are not as interested in having that relationship.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. Sounds like, you know, it'd be great to do a lot more comparative studies with other areas. But
Yeah.
let me jump back into some of these other questions. So one that is a popular question here asks, is there any current research going on that looks at the effects of the COVID-19 lockdown on cougar activity?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work starting up trying to figure out wildlife responses to COVID. There's some global projects that I'm not involved in that are just looking, I think, primarily at home range sizes and movement rates, maybe habitat selection at sort of a big course scale. But I'm also involved in a project here domestically trying to look at how animals are responding in national parks to changes in visitation from COVID. That's obviously going to be kind of a long-term project. It's hard to compile data and clean it and get everything sorted out. But one of our collaborators is looking specifically at movement responses in mountain lions in California. So we'll see what happens. I think it'll be pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's exciting. And I don't know if that question was planted by someone in my lab, but that's something we're trying to look at too here locally. So we'll be happy to compare notes with you on that. Another question that's come in is regarding the audio cues or the sound playbacks. Do you think the closeness of the speakers might have influenced reactions? So they say, might pumas have reacted differently to people at a distance versus a louder surprise nearby?
Yeah, there's always so many decisions you have to make in this experimental stuff. And so we try to be pretty conservative. We standardized the volume so that it would sound like someone was essentially right behind the tree. We tried to make it quiet enough that it, wasn't just the shock of the speaker coming on, which again is helped by having the control sound. But yeah, I think part of it might have been surprise. With recreation, people are generally talking as they're walking along a trail, perhaps, and so there's more of a warning than if it just all of a sudden was next to you. They also might not be used to hearing people at night as often, and mostly they came back to feed at their kills at night, so that could have increased the response a little bit. But I will say we did a follow-up experiment playing the sounds of dogs at these kill sites, the same methodology, because we had initially thought that dogs would be a positive control, that they might sometimes respond to people and sometimes not, but they would always be afraid of dogs. That turned out to be the opposite. They always responded to people, and then with dogs, they had all over the place responses. Sometimes they would approach the speaker and hiss at it. Sometimes they would flee. Sometimes they would be ambivalent. So there is something about human speech itself that is triggering them more than these other kinds of sounds that we've tried. But it could be that the response was stronger than you would see naturally just because of kind of the surprise element.
Right, yeah. We were sort of asked to wrap this up a few minutes before the hour, and I'm kind of anxious to ask you one more question about the second case study. So I'll take the moderator's prerogative here and ask that, and that might be just about wrapping up our questions. But I will remind people that Justine has put her email address on this last slide. So if you do want to follow up, I'm sure she'd be happy to hear from people. But so my last question, I've just been teaching in my undergrad wildlife ecology class one of the examples about the recovery of wildebeest from the rinderpest disease, and when that was eradicated, the incredible recovery of wildebeest and how that had such important implications for that system. And it's so neat to see your system down there where you've documented this huge collapse. And I'm wondering what you think about will the vicunas recover, and how long do you think it might take? And in the meantime, are other species benefiting from the release of that herbivory in the plains? Like, are you anticipating some interesting dynamics there that you'll be studying for the rest of your career?
I have so many thoughts about that I probably can't get into all of them in the last minute or two, but
Sorry.
one of the animals that I think probably is benefiting are the invasive European rabbits that live in the system, which, would have been competing with this dominant, ungulate herbivore and now have free reign. So I'm very concerned about the invasive species implications. And then in terms of the vicuña recovery, what I think will happen is that now that the plains have all of this great vegetation for feeding, vicuñas should be able to feed in these safer habitats and increase their numbers without having to expose themselves to predators. So I think we'll see an initial, once the mange is sort of under control or eradicated, if it's eradicated, I think we'll see a sort of exponential increase because of the access to safe forage resources. But then as soon as they deplete that, they're going to have to go in these dangerous habitats again to feed. And I don't know if that's going to be at the same density where they were at before. Like, is there going to be sort of an intermediate predator pit that happens where they can't totally get to the numbers from before because they're forced back into these dangerous habitats? And the pumas, I don't think that they're in the same densities as they were before. We don't have data on that, but anecdotally, my collaborator Julia Monk was there, and she saw them feeding on tucos, which is a burrowing rodent. So they can prey switch, right? These are generalist predators, and so they're there still and waiting, for the vicuñas to be available again. So I'm very curious what will happen. But hopefully we can find out.
Fascinating. And we'll definitely have you back to speak to us again, because I think on both those case studies, we're looking forward to seeing what you learn next in these systems. So thank you very much for speaking with us today, and thanks to everyone for joining the seminar. And much appreciated. And I hope we get you back again before too long, and in person too.
In person, absolutely. I've never actually been to UBC or the campus, so one of these days have to make it there.
For sure, absolutely. Okay, thanks, Justine. I think that we'll sign off now. I'm not sure. Michelle probably controls that, but thanks everyone for all the questions, and sorry to those who I didn't quite get to in the last couple minutes there.